So I'm making this video in honor of Black History Month, but I would like to preface it that Robert Smalls' case is an exceptional one, and that I recognize that many other African Americans did not enjoy the same fortunes as he did. Robert Smalls was born to his mother, Lydia Polite, and to an unknown father, in Beaufort, South Carolina. Lydia had worked in the fields most of her life, but was now a house hand for the slave owner, Henry McKee. Henry's property was in the city, so most of his slaves were those of housework. In his early years, Smalls was able to stay in the house with his mother, and was able to receive a minimum education from the environment in which he lived. This education was much more than most black people at the time had available to them. However, the cushiness of Robert's life worried his mother, because she was scared that he would grow ignorant and blind to what his fellow man was going through in the fields, and maybe even think of himself as above those black people who worked much more manual labor. So once Robert was 12, Lydia approached her master and asked if her son could be hired out as a laborer. Henry McKee indulged his slave's wishes and sent Robert to Charleston, South Carolina. Smalls worked many odd jobs here and there, from lamplighter to a hack driver, but where he found his real passion was with the ships in the harbor. It took a long time, but eventually, Smalls climbed his way up his available ladder to become a wheelman. Wheelman was a term used specifically for black people, so that there was still a distinction between a black and a white helmsman, and it referred to the black person who would steer the ship. During this time, Smalls married a woman, Hannah Jones, and had 2 children, an older girl, Elizabeth, and a younger boy, Robert Jr. For a while, Smalls set his sights on the goal of buying his freedom for him and his family. But this would cost Smalls $800, when he only made $1 per week from his labor. This would take over 15 years on its own. But there were still external expenses Mr. Smalls had to pay on his own, apart from expenses for his family. And every day that they weren't free was another day that Smalls or his family could be sold to another master, tearing their family apart. And in cases like that, it is almost unheard of for these families to be ever reunited again. The American political landscape had become increasingly hostile until the American Civil War erupted, when Smalls was working on and piloting a ship called the Planter. This vessel was employed by the Confederate government and was used as a scout, to plant mines, and as a transport ship in the context of men, weaponry, and messages for the Confederate Army. During his time working on this ship, Smalls saw an opportunity to achieve his freedom through a different means than payment. So Smalls took the lead, as he rallied the other slaves who were working on the ship, and began to plot. These men knew that their plan must succeed, lest they die or be tortured in a much worse slavery that their fellow man was experiencing already. But this could be one of their only opportunities to ever be free men. During this period, Robert gained the trust and favor of the white men aboard the ship, lulling them into a false sense of security, that Smalls loved working for them and the Confederacy. Finally, the slaves aboard the ship had hatched their escape plan, and were ready to put it into motion. So, when the Planter was docked at a Confederate post on the Stono River, to pick up some guns and bring them towards the Charleston harbor, the slaves requested for their families to visit them, which was nothing out of the ordinary. The white ship captain and his second mates allowed them to visit, as long as the families left by the slaves' curfew. While the families were visiting, the owners of the ship spent the night on shore, as was custom for the time. Now is when the slaves revealed their plan to their families, that they would commandeer the Planter and surrender to the Union blockade around the Charleston harbor. Many of the women took this as quite a shock, as they understood the risk of this maneuver, and that if they failed, they would most likely be killed for their involvement. However, the women were eventually able to be calmed and convinced to join the men's escape plan. So when the curfew came around, some of the men escorted the families home, but in reality, snuck them to a hiding place downstream aboard a different steamer. Now the crew lay and waited for their time to strike, which occurred around 3 in the morning, where Smalls donned the uniform of the captain, and the slaves made off with the Planter. Many watched as the Planter pulled away and made its way towards the Charleston harbor, including police officers. But their racism deluded them to think that slaves could never pull off such an endeavor. They all assumed that the ship's captain was aboard, and so no alarm was sounded. And this was the men's first obstacle passed. But that was the easy part. The Planter was loud, and an obvious ship due to its smoke trail. The Charleston harbor was insanely fortified, and there were several armed checkpoints the ship would have to pass due to this harbor's importance to the Confederacy. So the goal of Smalls dressing up as the captain was to be able to use the ambiguity afforded by the darkness of night to hopefully appear to be the real captain of the ship on a regular voyage. Many small canoes and civilian vessels full of slaves had fled towards the Union blockade before, but never with such a large ship. This feat would need a lot of luck and deception. The Planter's first stop on its voyage was to pick up the families of the crew downriver, where they were left to hide and wait. Once the families were picked up, they were hidden below deck to avoid suspicion from those on shore. But as I said before, the real test was still to come, as the ship still had to pass many checkpoints where Robert had to convincingly mimic his white captain and give those guards watching the ship pass the correct signals. During Robert's planning phase of his escape, he meticulously studied the captain's mannerisms and behavior to be able to convincingly pass as the man when passing these checkpoints. Luckily, the duties of the ship made it so that the Planter passed any checkpoints without needing to stop for any form of routine check-in or assessment. The ship passed most of the points with ease, but the part that brought terror into the hearts of the crew was the formidable Fort Sumter, which was fortified and armed to the teeth. By the time the Planter drew near to the fort, there were glimmers of the morning breaking over the horizon. Some of the crew begged Smalls to take their trajectory far from the fort to further obscure their colored skin. But Smalls knew that this was suspicious and would probably blow their cover immediately. Under this extreme pressure, Smalls used his skill as a sailor to signal everything properly to the fort, and now the Planter was on its way right for the Union line. Just as the ship was out of gun range of the fort, the crew lowered their Confederate flags and hoisted a white bedsheet as a sign of surrender to the Union ships. And now the Confederate alarms were ringing. But this is when Smalls' luck almost ran dry, as the commander of the ship the Planter was approaching began readying its guns and almost fired upon the slaves, as the captain didn't see the makeshift flag of surrender. But the white flag was seen just in the nick of time. The men's plan succeeded, and their surrender to the Union was very welcome, as the Planter was full of Confederate guns and ammunition. The crew of the Planter were all given prize money for the value of the ship and its cargo, and the North sensationalized this story in many newspapers, with Smalls becoming a national hero. Because Smalls piloted Confederate ships, and he was very intelligent, he had learned the ins and outs of local Confederate naval and army secrets, so the Union was very excited to have him on their side. Smalls gave the Union details that were otherwise impossible to know about the defenses, and lack thereof, in local forts, which directly led to the fall of Coles Island. He was even sent to pilot a Union ship during the Second Battle of Fort Sumter, but primarily, Smalls stuck with the Planter, which was now a Union vessel. Later in the war, when the captain of the Planter wanted to surrender in a precarious situation, Smalls took charge, and escaped with minimal damage to the ship. For his bravery in this situation, Robert was made the permanent captain of the Planter, which he captained for the rest of the war. Smalls and his family settled down in the home that he grew up in as a slave, as the state seized it from its previous owners for refusal to pay taxes. He would now begin to invest a lot of time into politics, and was elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives. Smalls continued to rise through the ranks to the national level of government, where he was elected to the United States House of Representatives. Throughout his career, Robert was constantly fighting against the efforts of many men to disenfranchise black people and strip them of many rights afforded to them at their emancipation. But despite his best efforts, many rights would still be taken away. Smalls would be one of the few black politicians left in the government at the end of his political career, and he advocated strongly for minority rights up until and after his professional career ended. And that's Robert Smalls highlighted. Please like and subscribe if you liked the video. And if you have any suggestions or comments, leave them in the comment section below, or email me with my email in the description. I also created a Patreon, patreon.com/stateofnations. If anyone is interested in supporting a small creator like myself,